Welcome everybody to UC Davis and the second GTI Symposium. It's really great to be here. Thank you, Professor Mayer, for that marvelous lecture, starting us off with the ceramics and cultural aspects of tea. Now we'll be turning to some scientific topics, and it's really my honor to introduce our next speaker this morning, Professor Selena Ahmed. She really, these days, I find myself very inspired by the young scientists who are coming up because, as our interim provost mentioned, one of the great things about this initiative is actually breaking down the boundaries of science and between sciences and the arts and between disciplines. And that's embodied in our next speaker. Professor Ahmed began her higher education at Barnard College, Columbia University, where in 2001 she earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. She then went on to earn a master's degree in ethnobiology in the Department of Anthropology at University of Kent at Canterbury and the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew in the UK. After earning her degree in 2004, she then came back to New York, where she pursued doctoral studies at the City University of New York Graduate School in Plant Sciences and earned a PhD in biology. And then she moved on to a very prestigious postdoctoral position at Tufts University, where she actually learned many of the analytical tools that she uses today to study the science and nutritional aspects of tea. So Professor Ahmed's accomplishments in agroecology and phytochemistry uniquely position her as a global scholar, really at the intersection of the ecological, cultural, and health aspects of food systems. And she has also focused on how agricultural environmental issues affect disparate economies and disparate communities. So we're very delighted to have Professor Ahmed here today at UC Davis's GTI Symposium to share her knowledge on environmental and management effects of tea. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to start by situating the socio-ecological context of my study by sharing some of the lessons I've learned in the field in the motherland of the tea plant, as well as some of the sites. So I'm going to take you to the mountains of southwestern China, to Yunnan province, which is the birthplace of the tea plant. And I've been working here for the past 11 years on the border of Laos, Burma, and Vietnam. So right over here in these tea mountains, as Professor Nair mentioned, this area is part of the birthplace of the tea plant. And it's an amazing place to study tea because it is the birthplace. It is the center of tea genetic diversity. Ecologically, it's very interesting. It's the Indo-Burma hotspot of biodiversity. Culturally, it's fascinating. There's about 26 different sociolinguistic groups that manage tea in different styles of agriculture. In terms of tea drinking, it's a beautiful sensory experience with lots of different diversity. So over here, tea can still be found growing in the forest populations. This is a tea tree that's 18 meters in height in Honghe Prefecture of Yunnan. And then along with the commercial species of tea, which is Camellia sinensis, there's 11 other species, wild relatives of Camellia sinensis in section Thea of Camellia, that can actually intergress with tea, the commercial tea, Camellia sinensis, and some of the sociolinguistic groups in this area bring some of the seeds into their gardens for integration. So you see this huge explosion of biodiversity of tea in this area. These are some of the stewards of the tea gardens that I work with in Yunnan. The Bulong, the Akha, the Yao, and the Lahu are the main communities that I've been working with that manage these beautiful tea gardens and who I've learned many lessons on sustainability for tea growing. And then in addition to the diversity that happens at the species level, there's also an incredible amount of land-raised diversity. And so as a botanist, I would say that these are all Camellia sinensis or Rhydia samica. But in fact, the local communities that all manage these within a tea garden that's less than 1 acre in size actually have different names for each of these different land races of tea, of Camellia sinensis. And so there's an amazing amount of ecological knowledge and linguistics that are associated with conserving this beautiful biodiversity of tea in this area. Some of the tea land races in this area can get quite large. Imagine one of these tea leaves unfurling in your teacup. And communities, this is the Aka community, and they manage tea gardens. And so what might look like a forest population around this community are actually tea gardens. And so I've been studying these tea gardens and their different management for the past 10 years to see how this influences biodiversity of the surroundings, as well as the quality of the tea plant itself and the benefits it brings to communities. This is one of my favorite tea gardens in the Bulong Mountains of Yunnan in Sichuan. And so here we see the farmer of in this tea garden is climbing up the tea tree to harvest. So sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a managed forest and the tea garden. And so here we're seeing tea along a continuum of agricultural intensification. This is tea growing in a forest population, mostly unmanaged, and then this is how most 99% of tea grows around the world. And then these are two types of traditional tea management in Yunnan province. This is a tea agroforest, and then this is a mixed tea crop field where tea has been intercropped with grains. And so both of these systems are organic in the way we understand organic production. And specifically, the agroforest tries to mimic the ecosystem services and structure and function of a forest environment, so farmers don't actually have to rely on the input of pesticides and herbicides, because they're really trying to mimic nature to provide them with those ecological services. And so I'm really fascinated to see how these different forms of agricultural management influence environmental health and then the health we have as human beings of consumers of products from these systems. And so tea from agroforests in the past decade has come to be very desirable by consumers around the world, and specifically in China's high-end markets. And actually since 2000, you could see how the price of tea has risen, and actually this past year it was more than $1,000 US. This is the price of 1 kilo of dried tea, and this is a price that the farmers are getting directly themselves. And so this is not the price at the market, but this is what farmers are getting. This is the farmer price, and then this is the blue line is for agroforest tea, and then the red line on the bottom is for terrace tea gardens. And so you can see there's really nice economic incentive to manage tea from these more sustainable systems. And then tea from these communities continues to be artisanally processed, hand rolled, and then dried. So this is interesting when we're sort of thinking about our Western concepts of hygiene, and this is some of the most expensive tea in the world and how it's dried. And then it's sorted, and sometimes it's pressed in different types of bamboo presses, and eventually it is sold as pu'er. And so that pu'er is consumed locally, and historically it was traded on the Tea Horse Road or Southwest Silk Road from the mountains of southwestern Yunnan up into the Tibetan Plateau to Lhasa to support the butter tea food system in the Tibetan Plateau. Fruits and vegetables are hard to grow in these high elevations, and so tea really became a substitute for vegetables in that area. And then more and more tea from these communities is sold in high-end tea markets throughout Asia. And so while I've been working with tea farmers in southwestern China, I've become very amazed at how people, when they're drinking tea, can really sense the environment and management practices. And so sometimes I'll be drinking tea with a farmer, and he can tell me the slope of the mountain where the tea was harvested, the elevation, the season, if it was near a water source, or perhaps some of the other plants in the area. So I've become very impressed with this ecological knowledge and what that can tell us about our agricultural systems more broadly. And this is just one example of learning about chemical ecology firsthand from tea farmers. And so this was a picture taken during one of my first field seasons in China in 2007, and I was sampling the biodiversity of tea gardens. And that evening, after I had completed my sampling, I was having tea in this household. And then just a few days later, the head of this household says, it has changed. The taste has changed. And it had only been a few days, and I was wondering how the taste of tea from the same tea garden could have changed in 3 days. And so what she was referring to was the onset of the East Asian monsoon. And so it was the end of April, beginning of May, and then the monsoons had hit. And as soon as the monsoons hit, tea quality, based on its secondary metabolite profiles, rapidly changes. And then when the monsoons retrieve, in the end of August or beginning of September, there's again a change in tea quality. And so this really fascinated me of how with climate change, there's more and more droughts, and then there's more and more extreme weather events. And what does this mean for tea quality in the context of global change? And from a socioeconomic perspective, this is very relevant. This is tea, the price of tea from an agroforest, and the top graph is the amount from during the spring season, and the lower graph is, or the curve, is the price of tea during the monsoon season. And so there could be up to a 50% drop in income for tea farmers with the onset of the East Asian monsoon. And farmers more and more were reporting that the monsoons were coming earlier and have also been increasing in length. And so this really had me thinking about how is climate change impacting tea quality, and are there agroecological management practices that farmers are implementing to mitigate the risk of global change. And so the more farmers I've spoken to have also verified in these areas that indeed they have witnessed increased precipitation variability, and this impacts the quality as well as yield, and ultimately their livelihoods and the sensory enjoyment they're getting from tea. And so these are some of just 5 of the lessons that I've learned from the tea farmers in the past 10 years that I wanted to share with you. Environmental and management factors drive tea quality. Tea quality is multidimensional. Mimic nature in tea gardens to benefit from ecosystem services. cultivate tea gardens for diversity at every level, at the landscape level, the genetic level, and the species level, and manage tea gardens for the long term and worst case scenarios. And so that's just some of the socio-ecological context of my study. Now I wanted to define tea quality. Tea quality is extremely multidimensional, and so I put some boundaries on defining it for my study over here. And so tea quality is largely determined by secondary metabolites. And secondary metabolites are, unlike the primary metabolites that are used for plants on a day-to-day basis, secondary metabolites are very much defense compounds in plants. So unlike animals that can escape from threats, environmental threats, predators, or extreme heat, plants are rooted and have had to develop this complex secondary metabolite system to protect themselves from all of these different environmental factors. And these different secondary metabolites represent an ecological or metabolic cost for the plant to produce, and plants will only produce these in certain concentrations if they have the ecological cue to do so. And the production of those secondary metabolites happens to be compounds that very much drive tea quality or tea attributes. And so when we're thinking about what these secondary metabolites are, we have caffeine, which gives us the stimulant properties, or theanine, which gives us the relaxing properties of tea, the polyphenolic catechins, which are responsible for the antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and cardioprotective health benefits of tea, as well as hundreds of volatile compounds that really influence the aroma and our sensory enjoyment of tea. And so all of these compounds that really help define tea quality are defense compounds in the plant, and the plant is producing them when it has the environmental cue to do so. And so these compounds also are associated with specific flavor profiles. For example, caffeine has a bitter flavor. Theanine has an umami or brothy flavor. The catechins are bitter with a sweet aftertaste. And this is also, when you were talking about that return of flavor, the catechins are very much responsible for some of that enduring flavor we have with tea. And then there's these hundreds of different volatile compounds, such as linalool, which contributes to some of the floral aromatic properties of tea, and geraniol. And so there's hundreds of compounds like this, which I'm not going to go through, but just to give you an example, there's almost 700 volatile compounds that have been identified to contribute to tea aroma. So it's an extremely complex system. And then from my own primary research, as well as from the scientific literature, these are the 6 environmental factors that most influence the tea secondary metabolites. So we have seasonality, soil composition, light, shade, and UVB, altitude, herbivorous pathogens, and then geographic factors. So these are the main environmental factors that are driving the production of tea secondary metabolites. And then what's very interesting is that human consumers have the ability to perceive variation of environmental factors based on the presence and concentration of these specific secondary metabolites. So over here we see tea ratings based on intensity from a scale of 2 to 5. And then this is the total catechin content. And we see that the samples that actually have more secondary metabolites, more catechins, are also rated by consumers as having more intense flavor. And so there's this relationship between sensory attributes and the secondary metabolites. And then these influence consumers' buying decisions and ultimately farmer livelihoods. And so the third part of this talk, I'm going to present some of my evidence from my research on looking at just one of these environmental factors and how it impacts tea quality. I'm going to focus on seasonality as that's one of the questions that has very much driven my research, thinking about climate change. And I'm also going to focus on the management practice of agricultural diversification, comparing how managing tea in agroforest compared to a terrace plantation impacts tea quality. And so I've very much been intrigued with how tea quality varies along this continuum of agricultural intensification. And so for my PhD research, I had carried out sampling in tea agroforest as well as in terrace plantations in the same community in the Aka uplands of in Sichuan-Bana. And I carried out high-performance liquid chromatography measuring 13 different catechin compounds, and for this index called Total Catechin Content Index. And my research showed that there was more than 2 times the amount of catechin compounds that contribute to the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties of tea in the tea agroforests that were at the same elevation and in the same community with the same tea land races. And then I also, more recently, was very interested in answering the research question if tea quality could really shift in just a few days with the onset of the East Asian monsoon. So a few years ago, I got to Yunnan during their most extreme drought, and I sampled, and I kept on sampling tea until the monsoons hit. And so this data over here shows tea yields basically during 15 days of sampling. So this is going from the spring drought, which was the most severe drought in Yunnan, through the monsoon onset to the monsoon. So there's about 5 days of sampling during this period. And we see this significant increase in the weight and yield of tea just during these 15 days. As we would expect, the plants were feeling some relief from the rains. And then what happens to tea quality during that same 15-day period? And so these are different catechin compounds that contribute to tea quality. And we found that during this 15-day period, there was a significant drop in these different secondary metabolites that drive tea quality. And in some cases, it was up to 50% change in concentration of these individual secondary metabolites, which I thought was very interesting. And then this is the work that I measure in my lab, and then my collaborators at Tufts University that use GCGC to look at all of the volatiles also found that overall there was higher concentrations of volatile compounds in the spring samples, as well as not only higher concentrations, but higher number of compounds. In addition, thinking about what the flavors of those compounds are, the compounds that were unique to the spring samples were also the ones that have sensory aspects that are considerable flavor preferable, such as floral or sweet or honey-like, whereas some of the compounds that were only present during in the monsoon samples are those that don't have as positive connotations. For example, like a sulfuriness or vegetal attribute. And so some of the compounds that were in the monsoon samples were actually not considered flavor preferable. And then I've been working with 5 different consumer sensory panels to evaluate if consumers are able to perceive changes in the chemistry, both with tea farmers and tea connoisseurs in China, as well as with Western consumers. And so it's really interesting how cultures in different areas influences our sensory preferences. And what I found is that the spring samples really are a lot more intense, and so sometimes Western consumers don't actually have a preference for the intensity of those tea samples. But overall, we found in all of our sensory panels that consumers do prefer the spring tea samples, but definitely in the tea drinking communities in China, there's more of a preference for intense and bitter teas. And then just situating that in the context of the literature, I carried out a systematic review to see what the evidence in the literature is on environmental effects and tea quality, looking at almost 8,000 articles and finding only 86 that were really relevant for my research question. And I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the ones that focus specifically on the impacts of seasonality or drought or water stress on tea quality. We found out of the 86 studies, 25 of the studies focused on this specific research question, and we found that the majority showed that tea quality is higher during the spring or a dry season compared to the monsoons in the different secondary metabolite classes. And so what does this mean in the context of climate change? The research that I showed was just a snapshot from one specific season. I have a grant from the National Science Foundation where we have replicated that sampling as climate change is a long-term of an event. We've replicated that sampling in 9 different sites throughout China, and representing different agroclimatic conditions and in high and low elevation sites as well. Over 5 years and 3 different seasons. And so now we're correlating the secondary metabolite chemistry to the climate factors in terms of precipitation, temperature, and humidity. So that's data analysis that's currently underway, but I wanted to just share a snapshot of what's happening at the main study site where I showed how tea quality changes just in 15 days with the onset of the East Asian monsoon. So over here we see that there's expected in the future to be a decrease in precipitation and during the spring season, and an increase in precipitation during the monsoon season, which is very interesting because it's not necessarily all doom and gloom for tea or for tea producers. We actually see that the increase in drought could actually provide heightened tea quality during the spring season, but then lower tea quality during the monsoon season, which really shows that there's a need to manage tea quality in a very multidimensional way throughout the growing season. And however, if we're doing greenhouse experiments right now to see how much drought is too much. So if there's too much drought, then the plant actually won't be able to produce healthy tea altogether. And so that's some of the testing that we're doing right now. And so this was at the main study site in Yunnan, and then over time, what are we seeing in terms of climate in China? And this is in all of China's tea-producing areas. We're seeing overall there's an upward trend in precipitation in tea production areas in China. At the same time, we're seeing a downward trend in precipitation in tea-producing areas in China. And so what is the role of agroecological management in mitigating this risk of climate change? Are there more sustainable ways of growing tea that can really mitigate this? And so earlier, as I had shown, the tea agroforests were associated with higher quality. And as I've done interviews with tea farmers, they've also indicated that the agroforests are more resilient to extreme droughts and other weather events, as well as other factors of global change. And over here, we did the same sampling, looking at the onset of the monsoon and comparing the drop-in chemistry between the agroforest and the terrace plantations, and we see that indeed in both cases there is a drop in tea quality. However, the agroforest is able to buffer some of that drop in tea quality, so it's not as extreme for tea producers and tea quality. And so overall, my research has really highlighted how tea is an extremely sensitive crop and could really be an indicator species for looking at global environmental change. And then our sense and ability to taste as consumers can also be an indicator, or we can be sensors ourselves of looking at the effects of global change on crop quality of tea, but other crops as well. And then finally, I wanted to leave you with the question of what is the role of agroecological management in mitigating risk and really protecting our tea systems and food systems more broadly. Thank you.